Okay. All right, everybody.
I used to say,
The Lord be with you.
and also with you.
Go. Let's start with a prayer. Dear God, thank you for the gift of creativity. Help us to nurture and develop it in all areas of our lives. Guide us to use our creativity to bring about positive change in the world, addressing challenges with fresh perspectives. Amen.
Amen.
Let me start my. I want,
Almost time for 11s.
yes, you can go ahead and start.
Second breakfast is the hottest.
Yeah, there we go. Second breakfast. So we've got the slides up there. I'm going to be working off my speaker's notes. And one reason I'm going to work off my speaker's notes, this t-shirt is from my favorite Tolkien podcast, the Prancing Pony podcast. And the original co-hosts, this is one of their taglines. We digress. So if I don't work off notes, we would be here for like hours and hours and hours. So JRR Tolkien, show of hands and then keep your hands up. Who has read Tolkien? Who has seen the movies? Okay, so we have some people who have not seen the Peter Jackson movies or read the books. And this is perfectly fine because absolutely no knowledge of Tolkien or his works is required for this class. I'm mostly looking at the person of J.R.R. Tolkien, his beliefs and his talents, how his faith was such a part of him that it showed up in The Lord of the Rings without saying a word. Now, I do want to note that all of the drawings in this presentation, save for two, were done by Tolkien. So that's just another part of his creativity and his talent. Moving on to the next slide. When I first started pulling this together, I was a little bit overwhelmed because there was just a few things, like everything, that I knew about Tolkien that I wanted to impart. And so this is somewhat what I whittled it down to. And I'm just wondering, as you look at that word map there, are there any words that you find intriguing, interesting? Just call out one or two or three or four. Eucatastrophe. Okay.
Evil, dark, and myth.
Evil, dark, and myth. Okay.
Power corrupts.
That's one theme I actually don't get to today.
Beowulf.
Beowulf.
In some sense, but.
Okay.
What did the JR and R stand for?
John Ronald Rule. And Rule was a family name. And I heard some more words back here.
Kitty.
Kitty.
Small hands, big work.
Small hands, big work.
Philologist.
Yep, philologist.
Philologist.
There you go. All right. Some of these I will cover, some I will not, because even though I pared it down, I don't think you guys want to stay here for the next 6 hours. I would be happy to talk Tolkien for 6 hours. Okay, moving on. An incredibly brief bio. He was born in 1892 in Bloemfontein, which is now South Africa. You'll notice he lost both of his parents by the time he was 12. His mother had converted to Catholicism when Tolkien was 8. And for this, she was disowned by her family, completely disowned. And in fact, Tolkien wrote in a letter to his then adult son, Michael, I witnessed the heroic sufferings and early death in extreme poverty of my mother, who brought me into the church, and received the astonishing charity of Francis Morgan. Now, Francis Morgan was Tolkien and his brother Hilary's guardian. His mother had diabetes, which at that time was terminal. And she had talked to Father Francis and asked him to be the boy's guardian. Tolkien had a classical education, attended Oxford University from 1911 to 1915. Of course, in 1914, World War I began. And once you start studying Tolkien, one of the famous phrases you hear is his quote, by 1918, he was 26, all but one of my close friends were dead. He did marry Edith Bratt in 1916. They had 4 children. His career took him to the Oxford English Dictionary, Leeds University, Oxford University. Here comes the Beowulf. He did seminal work on Beowulf, actually encouraging people to study it as a poem, as opposed to just a historical fiction, or yeah, a historical fiction. For those of you who don't know, Beowulf is, they date it to roughly 1000 AD. It's the oldest thing we have in Old English. And he died in 1972, which is right about the time I started reading Tolkien. So to circle back, by the time he was 26, he had experienced so much loss. Next slide, please. By war's end, many of his friends from King Edward's School, which would have been like his junior high school, had been killed, as had many of those with whom he had matriculated at Exeter College in Oxford, 1911. And the 11th Lancashire Fusiliers, the battalion in which he had served before falling ill, was nearly annihilated in 1918. I guess you could say it was lucky that he caught trench fever after about 5-6 months of combat trench warfare. And he spent months in his first of many convalescences. He was never fit enough after that, recurring illnesses for which he needed to be hospitalized, to go back to the front lines. I think it was last week that Alex offered the thought that many mystics have similar sorts of experiences in that they suffer loss and are considered or feel an outsider. Well, loss, Tolkien, check. It's interesting that Tolkien's parents were English, but he was born outside of England and therefore was always considered a colonial, even though he lived in England from the time he was 3 for the rest of his life. He was also a Catholic in the early 1900s, which was not an easy thing to be in at that time, at that place. So outsider, check. Moving on. So for many people who were directly or indirectly involved in World War I, it was very common for those people in the war, after the war, to have feelings of fatalism, lack of faith in religion or a person or a government, feelings of having no control, bleak outlook, having despair. And indeed, Tolkien wrote to his son Michael that for a time in the 1920s that he, Tolkien, almost ceased to practice my religion. He also wrote of depression being an almost universal human malady. And so this is a line from The Fellowship of the Ring. The world is indeed full of peril, and in it there are many dark places. Now, I was going to go directly onto
Is that his artwork?
that, yes, all his artwork. I was going to go directly onto the slide, but let me just repeat the first line of today's final blessing. The world is now too dangerous and too beautiful for anything but love. Next slide, please. The world is indeed full of peril, and in it there are many dark places, but there is still much that is fair. And though in all the lands love is now mingled with grief, it grows perhaps the greater. And so Tolkien chose differently. And while he did slack in his faith for some years in the 1920s, the works that he produced, specifically The Lord of the Rings, are rooted in hope, love, and faith. Next slide. So that's just very, very quickly a brief overview of some of the early years of his life and some things that sort of set him up in his emotional well-being or non-well-being. Now, let's talk about what I believe was his primary passion, language. He was a prodigy with language. I don't know how many languages he ended up speaking, but he could read by age 4 and write competently thereafter. The shapes and the sounds that word and sentences made were incredibly important to him, as were the questions of where do words come from? How are they related to other words? And how are they related to similar words in other languages? Again, once you start diving down into Tolkien, this little story comes up. I first tried to write a story when I was about 7. It was about a dragon. I remember nothing about it except a philological fact. My mother said nothing about the dragon, but pointed out that one could not say a green great dragon, but had to say a great green dragon. I wondered why, and still do. So, Betsy.
Well, there could have been green lesser dragons.
This is true. This is absolutely true. Yes.
It just kind of sounds better, I think, because it's like great green dragon.
Mhm.
It's like, it's a nice little pattern to the tongue.
It is, it is. So I highlighted the word philological, and that's the word that Austin picked out from the word slide, well, a form of it. So if we now go to the next slide, because I needed to find out what is this philology? It's the study of language and how language evolves, combined with the effects of culture, literature, place, and time, all thrown in as considerations. Simplistically, the way I look at it, and this might not be exactly true, but the way I look at it is linguistics is the overarching scientific study of language. And philology is sort of like the social science aspect of language studies. Does that sort of make sense? Okay.
So that's why we have brat as the word of the year for tooth there.
Great. Okay, moving on. Tolkien loved playing with language so much that he invented languages. The earliest language he invented was developed with some of his cousins when he was a young teen. He went on to create not 1, but 2 different Elven languages. Berlin Flieger, who is the first quote on this slide, is one of today's foremost scholars on Tolkien's works and is blazingly insightful and intelligent. I've actually been able to sit in on a class with her, and it's incredibly scary if you open your mouth because she will ask you a very pithy question and you're like, don't even know what to say. She writes in one of her books that Tolkien came to regard the invention of languages, listen to this, as the index of a world, the agent and reflection of its spiritual and cultural attitudes, and the repository of its myth and history. What?
Yeah.
Now, if you're perhaps thinking that Tolkien didn't have the same view for actual real languages, here's his quote at the bottom. It would be more near the truth to say that languages, especially modern European languages, are a disease of mythology. Okay. His view is that languages are permeated with spirituality, culture, mystery, history, and myth. It's just mind-boggling. The other thing that you need to know if you decide to read any Tolkien, or if you go back and reread it, is that Tolkien also delighted in using old words in their archaic senses. So you might come across a word that you think you know, but the sentence doesn't really make sense, and it's because he's using an old definition of that word. So just so you know. Now, you may think, this is fine, I don't read Tolkien, don't plan to read Tolkien, but I want to show you that you probably have been affected by Tolkien. Tell me the plural of dwarf.
Dwarves.
Dwarves, dwarfs. Anybody say anything different? Nobody is going for dwarfs? So everybody agrees it's dwarves
With a,
with a V.
I'm gonna say it's an F.
Okay, you go. So we have one vote for Walt Disney, two votes for Walt Disney, 1937, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, F.
Yes.
1937, publication of The Hobbit. Bilbo goes on an adventure with 13 dwarves. Dwarves was not attested in the English language before then, except for one time in 1818. So the reason we now accept dwarves is Tolkien. Okay, so there is culture and history in the simple word of dwarves. Okay, moving on. Continuing on this language theme, let's look at this quote. This is from a lecture that Tolkien delivered in 1936. The human mind, endowed with the powers of generalization and abstraction, sees not only green grass, but sees that it is green as well as being grass. How powerful, how stimulating was the invention of the adjective. No spell or incantation in fairy is more potent. What?
Wow.
We're talking about adjectives, that boring little part of language. I mean, really, who writes like this about the beauty and power and magic of adjectives? So I think perhaps I've made my point. Language and Tolkien, Tolkien and language, it's a love affair. Moving on. Now let's talk about myth for a bit. Now, C.S. Lewis famously wrote a letter that talked about a day's discussion that Lewis had with Hugo Dyson, who was another university professor, and Tolkien in September of 1931. At that time, Lewis had shifted from atheism to theism, but was still unable to commit to Christianity. In the extended discussion of these three learned men, they spoke of faith, history, and theology. Then the topic turned to myth. As I understand it, Lewis viewed parts of the Christian doctrine as myth and therefore discounted them, saying that myths were, quote, lies breathed through silver. Now remember what we've already seen about Tolkien's thoughts and myth. Next slide. Myth and language are combined and cannot be separated. So, myths, they only carry spiritual attitudes, cultural beliefs. Tolkien did believe that there's logos, the truth, capital T, the word made flesh, Jesus. But myths are not to be taken lightly. They are the response of a created people, of a creator God, and they are trying to reach out and understand the divine. So Lewis claims that myths are lies, and Tolkien, next slide, Tolkien, being Tolkien, left that discussion, went home and wrote a 148-line poem that defended myths and that argued that the Christian story is the one true absolute myth. Now, I'm not taking you through all 148 lines. I did some sections. These are actually 3 different sections. They have seen death and ultimate defeat, and yet they would not in despair retreat, but off to victory have tuned the lyre and kindled hearts with legendary fire, illuminating now and dark hath been, with light of suns as yet by no man seen. Blessed are the legend makers with their rhyme of things not found within recorded time. Be sure they still will make not being dead, and poets shall have flames upon their head, and harps wherein their faultless fingers fall, and there each choose forever from the all. Reactions. Tears. It's a little overwhelming. Tolkien's, the way he can say things and his word choice sometimes, and since I've only done, cherry picking, because I'm going to try to prove a point here in a moment, you don't get his whole argument.
I love the flames on the head, kind of like the idea
Yes,
of that and just the illumination that we always see.
right,
Back to Hildegard of Bingen.
right. Mhm. Back to Hildegard of Bingen. Mhm.
What comes to my mind, which may be way off base, is blessed are the legend makers with their rhyme. And I think about, as we talk about myth and legends, the Native Indian and their spirituality. And how wonderful that is.
Mhm. Right,
Like the talking of also harps with the fingers, because we all write with our hands.
Mhm.
We typically write with voices, but traditionally it's with your hand. And I think it's really interesting that it's, it kind of it talks about forever and it locks it in, and that's kind of what, like with music, it's, a lot of things. I mean, yes, we have variations and whatever, but it's still, the themes of music, there's things we would all recognize.
right. Mhm.
Stories historically were myths
Exactly.
before the written language,
Mhm.
because they're telling stories of the tribe,
Right.
not the actual facts of myth,
Mhm.
which is fascinating.
Right, right. And so there's an emphasis on what's important and how they interpreted, and yes, lovely.
I'm thinking, Sarah, of Dumbledore, when Harry Potter asked him, did it happen? And he says, no, it didn't happen, but that doesn't make it any less real.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Mhm. Okay, so you might have guessed that I chose these three snippets for a particular reason. Next slide. Look at the highlighted bits. And the first one is a little nebulous. You sort of have to think about the whole thing. So that first, the left-hand slide is really talking about after a victory, people creating a song and telling a story, and possibly a story that no man has ever seen. So they're imagining, they're creating. It might be based on something true, it might not. And then the second one, blessed are the legend makers with their rhyme of things not found within recorded time. Again, imagination, creation, but telling something that is good or true or encouraging, and still they will make. Okay, so where are we going with this? Next slide. The sub-creator. This was one of Tolkien's really strong beliefs. Again, let's just take in Tolkien's view of the power of words and language and description in a story. When we take green from grass, blue from heaven, and red from blood, we have already an enchanter's power. But in such fantasy, as it is called, new form is made, fairy begins, man becomes sub-creator. Sub-creation to Tolkien's mind was an alleluia, a song of praise back to his creator. And Tolkien dove deep into sub-creation. For those who have read any of Tolkien's works of Middle-earth, that's the Silmarillion, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, the inner consistency of Middle-earth is one of the most mentioned and most beloved items. He tracks things down to the details of the phases of the moon and a reasonable number of miles a party might cover in a single day. Back in 1968, Edward Fuller, who was an American educator and novelist and many other things, wrote this critique of The Lord of the Rings. For this world, he, Tolkien, has created self-contained geography with maps, like this one, a mythology and a balladry, a history in great depth and completeness of organization stretching back far beyond the time span of his story. It's funny that Fuller didn't mention languages because, you know, I'm not going to go over, you know, skip over that. So remember those two Elven languages that I mentioned earlier that Tolkien had created? If I had another 30 minutes, I'd tell you how Tolkien's Middle-earth started with the invention of an Elven language. And then he decided that he needed to write the stories of the people who spoke that language. Because language and the stories of the people that speak that language are part and parcel of one another. Next slide. Which is why this is so true and so funny. Tolkien teaches intro to fiction. Who here knows the first thing an author must do when beginning their novel? Develop characters? No, the first step is constructing an entire elf language from scratch, always. Okay, so I presented very briefly sketch of Tolkien's early life experiences, his response to them, his choice of ultimately responding to World War I with hope rather than despair, and given you just the merest peep into his writings and thoughts on language, myth, and subcreation. Now, let's take a lightning quick look at just some of the major themes of Lord of the Rings. Now, I know not everybody here has read Lord of the Rings, so I'm going to give you one of the world's quickest summaries. There is a magic ring that belongs to a big bad guy. Think fallen angel, and you're going to be not far off. This guy's name is Sauron. With that ring's power, Sauron would be able to dominate the entire world. Sauron lost this ring ages ago, but has heard rumors that the ring has been found by a hobbit, a 3 to 3.5 foot tall hobbit, name of Frodo Baggins. Now, how do the people, the free peoples of Middle-earth, save the world? They must destroy the ring, which can only be done back where it was made, which happens to be in the fire of a volcano, ominously called Mount Doom. And that just happens to be back in the land that's basically in Sauron's backyard. So a wizard, wise elves are consulted to help Frodo. A band of 8 additional people are chosen to accompany Frodo, and they set out on the quest to Mount Doom. Problems ensue. The ring is destroyed, the world is saved, ta-da, the end. Okay, so let's look at some themes. Next slide. Friendship. Friendship matters so much. At the heart of the Lord of the Rings, you have the Fellowship. This is, other than the comic, this is the one piece of art that is not done by Tolkien, just so you know. So at the heart of the Lord of the Rings, you have the Fellowship, a collection of 9 persons. Humans, wizard, elf, dwarf, hobbits. Frodo's been charged to take the ring to Mount Doom. The friendship, love, and commitment among these persons, as well as many along their way, is heartfelt. In this scene, you have Frodo, who is going to be starting off on his journey, and he knows that it's incredibly dangerous, and he doesn't want to take any of his friends with him. But his friends have been too clever and they know what he's up to, and they're not going to let him go alone. And they basically said, hey, buddy, we know everything, we're coming with you. So Frodo's feeling a little betrayed. Here's the scene. But it does not seem that I can trust anyone, said Frodo. It all depends on what you want, put in Merry. You can trust us to stick to you through thick and thin to the bitter end. And you can trust us to keep any secret of yours closer than you keep it yourself. But you cannot trust us to let you face trouble alone and go off without a word. We are your friends, Frodo. We are horribly afraid, but we are coming with you or following you like hounds. And that deep sense of friendship and commitment to a person and to helping them is strewn all through The Lord of the Rings. Next slide. Small hands, even as small as hobbit hands, can make a difference. Tolkien shows again and again that it's not always the expected hero with a sword that can move the fate of the world. In this first quote, you have Elrond, very wise, very old elf, talking with Gandalf, very wise, very old wizard, and they're trying to decide who to send along with Frodo on this quest. And frankly, I can't tell you now which one of the two of them says this, but here's the quote. Such is the course of deeds that move the wheels of the world. Small hands do them because they must, while the eyes of the great are elsewhere.
Sounds like Gandalf.
Probably is Gandalf, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Could be Elrond, but yeah, I think I just didn't actually mark that in my notes. And what's interesting is in the Fellowship, you do have Aragorn, who is destined to become the High King. And while his role is not small on the quest in helping to destroy the One Ring, he's not the one who does it. It's not through the strength of a king or an impressive army that Sauron's realm is penetrated and the ring is brought back to Mount Doom. The journey into that land was made by two small, physically unimposing hobbits. More so, these hobbits are exhausted and starving and worn and heartsick. Now for the second quote, this one is Mercedes Lackey, and I don't know how many of you know of her. She's slightly older than I am, American fantasy author. And this is part of what she offered about the influence of Tolkien on her own writing. And when I came to start writing, one thing stuck in my mind. Often the most memorable parts are not the great battles and great sacrifices, the cast of thousands and the high kings. The most memorable are ordinary people forced by circumstances to do extraordinary things. And I think that's also one of the things that pulls people into the story, in that I know for me as an ordinary person, I can identify with these ordinary people within the story, the hobbits who have always been on the periphery of great, they haven't even been part of great things. They're just, off over there. So that's a second theme. Moving on. Choices matter. In Tolkien's Middle-earth, there are definitive and observable powers of good and evil in the world. Even still, folk have free will and their choices matter. Do you succumb to evil ways? Do you sit on the sidelines and watch? Or do you strive for peace and justice? Toward the very beginning of the story, the wizard Gandalf gives Frodo the horrific news that Frodo's inherited ring from his beloved uncle is a magic ring, a ring of untold evil and power. And Frodo responds with this: I wish it need not have happened in my time, said Frodo. So do I, said Gandalf, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. One of the best quotes, although I'll say that about 20 different ones. Frodo's choices, once he's learned of his own personal peril, but also the peril that the ring he bears for the entire world, will move him and perhaps the world toward what is right. Frodo has to decide for himself whether to resist evil. Tolkien wrote this in one of his letters. In the last resort, faith is an act of will, inspired by love. And it's not a one-time decision. In this next reading, the fellowship is some 9 months down the road on the quest. And they've recently suffered the death of their leader, the wizard Gandalf, and are taking some ease and comfort in the elven land of Lorien. The wise and powerful elven queen Galadriel tells the entire fellowship, your quest stands on the edge of a knife. Stray but a little, and it will fail to the ruin of all. Yet hope remains while all the company is true. All of them, meaning the fellowship, all of them, it seemed, had fared alike. Each had felt that he was offered a choice between a shadow of fear that lay ahead and something that he greatly desired. Clear before his mind it lay. And to get to it, he only had to turn aside from the road and leave the quest and the war against Sauron to others. So this act of faith, this act of will is something that you have to choose again and again. And indeed, again, from one of the letters of Tolkien, but the act of will of faith is not a single moment of decision. It is a permanently, indefinitely repeated act. So the choices one makes with one's free will do matter. However, next slide. Tolkien, as a medievalist and historian, a philologist, had a fondness for the Old English poem Beowulf and the epics and stories of Northern Europe of Beowulf's time about 1000 AD. In the poem, there is presented the circle of light. This describes a situation that is tolerable now. You're within the circle of light, but you know that the dark and the evil forces are utterly surrounding you. Now, the ethic of Northern courage meant that you would go down fighting, even against impossible odds, because that was the right thing to do. Even if you knew that any victory won today could well be reversed tomorrow, and darkness would continue to encroach. Tolkien called this the long defeat. You might win for the day, you will never win for all time. This long defeat is something that we humans are doomed to. Doomed to darkness and error and pain, to face monsters that are always waiting to destroy. Because in this world, evil is. There is no triumphant victory that lasts for all time, unless one looks to God. Next slide. Eucatastrophe. In a letter, Tolkien wrote, I coined the word eucatastrophe, the sudden happy turn in a story which pierces you with a joy that brings tears. Now, we've all heard of catastrophe, right? The U prefix, EU, we should all know this, Eucharist, right? EU, good. The eucatastrophe is the good catastrophe. As you see here, a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. It denies universal final defeat, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. In the eucatastrophe, we see in a brief vision that the answer may be greater. It may be a far-off gleam or echo of evangelium, the good news, in the real world. In that same letter I quoted about eucatastrophe, Tolkien continued, he's writing to his son, I concluded by saying that the resurrection was the greatest eucatastrophe possible in the greatest fairy story, and produces that essential Christian joy, which produces tears because it is so qualitatively like sorrow, because it comes from those places where joy and sorrow are at one, reconciled. Now, I have a bit of bad news. I cannot really share with you one of these moments from the Lord of the Rings, because in order to get the entire setup, you need to be in the story. And I can't give you enough of that background, but I can give you a taste. Next slide. At this point in the story, we're very close to the end. Frodo and his very, very faithful sidekick, Sam. And Sam's been by Frodo's side every step of the way. Almost. There's one point where they got separated. They're very close to the end of their journey. Not that they know that yet. At this time, they're cold, starving, parched. They're in Sauron's evil land where hardly anything grows. They're desperately afraid. There, peeping among the cloud rack above a dark tor high up in the mountains, Sam saw a white star twinkle for a while. The beauty of it smote his heart as he looked up out of the forsaken land, and hope returned to him. For like a shaft, clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end, the shadow was only a small and passing thing. There was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. So it's not eucatastrophe, but it's close. Again, one of the most beautiful passages from The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien wrote this: I have purposely kept all allusions to the highest matters down to mere hints, perceptible only by the most attentive, or kept them under unexplained symbolic form. So God and the angelic gods, the lords or powers of the West, only peep through in such places as Gandalf's conversation with Frodo. Behind that, there was something else at work, beyond any design of the ringmakers, or in Faramir's Númenórean grace at dinner. So here I am wrapping this up. And I'm firmly of the belief that The Lord of the Rings, a book of over 1,100 pages, a book that does not mention God, has one prayer in it, which is really just a moment of silence before a meal, is so steeped in Tolkien's faith that his story and his language has imparted so much of the Christian faith behind the scenes that the Christian message of joy, hope, love, and ultimate salvation is testament to Tolkien's mysticism. And it's in these messages that make so many of us fall in love with Middle Earth, and we want to return to it again and again. And that made me think of the title I put on here, which I thought at 7 o'clock this morning when it was too late to change the slide. Preach the gospel at all times, use words as necessary. Well, Tolkien used just a few words. So I'm going to paraphrase this by saying, preach the gospel at all times, use explicitly religious words if necessary. So we have language, we have myth, we have the call to be sub-creators. And our hymn today, we are all are one in mission. This struck me because I knew what was coming. We are all called for service to witness in God's name. Our ministries are different. Our purpose is the same: to touch the lives of others by God's surprising grace, so people of all nations may feel God's warm embrace. Last slide, please. So here's the invitation. Go create something. Let your faith shine through your acts, your words, your creation. It could be a story that takes you 14 years to write, or it could be some doodles on a piece of paper, It could be a song, a poem, a meal you make. They are all creation. And God sees that it is good. Thank you. Just so you know, the full quote underneath his photo there, hang on, I'm trying to see it, is talking about the Lord of the Rings. It is written in my lifeblood, such as that is, thick or thin, I can do no other. There you go. Questions, comments?
Yeah.
You think? I did also, I was going to point out on the title slide, somebody did a interview with Tolkien back in 1966. And one of her comments about people who read and love the Lord of the Rings is its addicts are many and generally incurable.
So how many times do you think you've read it?
So I first discovered The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings when I was about 10. From then until about age 30, I read it religiously once a year. And then children came along. So in the last 30 years, I've probably read it only 6 times. So, right.
Did you say little hobbits came along?
Yep. Although they're both taller than 3.5 feet now.
Yeah.
Just like.
Yep.
The Hobbit, that cartoon was what drove me, the original, I
The-
don't even know if it's the original.
Rankin
cartoon.
and Bass.
Yeah,
Mhm.
but that drove me in as a pretty young.
Yep. Yep.
I was gonna say it, one time in my mid-20s, first time I read the Hobbit and then the Lord of the Rings. I could name the 13 dwarves that Bilbo accompanied to the Misty Mountains
Mhm.
more easily than I could name 12 apostles. But in my defense, the Gospels don't agree on 12.
Neither do they have the like sets, like Owen and Glowin,
Right.
and
Dorian
Feely and
Gray.
Killy.
Yeah.
Mhm, right. So they tend not to come in pairs, nice rhythmic pairs like that.
That's true.
So,
That was so much fun.
oh,
Thank
good.
you for taking us on that journey.
As I told Felicia, at first it was like, oh my gosh, because I wanted to tell you everything. And I have 2 bookshelves of Tolkien. And I probably had a good portion of one entire bookshelf down, and I was looking through things and finding references. And the thing is, with my online Tolkien friends, I know like this much, and it seems like everybody else knows this much. And so I was concerned about getting everything absolutely, and it's like, wait a minute, I don't think that type of person is gonna be at St. Paul's. So I can gloss over a few things. Thank you, you were incredibly attentive.
This is a little bit of foreshadowing because one of the sabbatical plans, because we're talking about pilgrimage and quest, is to watch the movies on a Saturday afternoon, not all together, one after the other, but on different Saturdays. And Sarah's agreed to be available at the coffee hour following the viewing of movies to talk about those. So that this summer.
Yeah.
Great fun.
Thank you all.
I wanted to just return to the idea that you expressed here, which is the of Tolkien's idea that the evil in the world is so small. You know, that ultimately it doesn't have much power. That's something I
Mhm.
The little can overwhelm it.
Mhm.
you know, and will always might take a while.
Right,
I think that concept of a Yucca
you catastrophe.
catastrophe is really good.
Yeah.
And it makes me think, what comes to mind for me is, and how over time we do, things progress. and I think about our treatment manuals. Like, and I'm sure that wasn't the only humane society, but the humane society, the first humane society that I know of was partly founded by William Wilberforce. So the mid 19th century.
Okay.
And ever since then, we've started to, and before that, other ways too, but we've treated animals differently. And we're not going back on that. It's that kind of change over time that is inextractable because our consciousness has changed about the way we should treat one another in everything. Those are things that's a eucatastrophe, because at some point, somebody or somebody's small group of people thought we should treat animals differently. And we're going to found an effort that will, at least in our local area, treat animals differently. And then that has become something embraced by us all. So.
I think another thing that stands out to me is that, again, that emphasis on the little person's contribution. There's a way in which it's kind of British, because I think about a couple other science fiction writers who are British, who have that same kind of thing. It's like, it's the little ordinary interactions that really make the difference in these really tough times. So one World War II writer who talks about the people huddling together in the underground, and the songs and plays and stuff that they told each other while their city was being bombed. And again, those things are what carries the day. And by the same token, for Tolkien, it's the little wrongnesses in the evil people's world, is that they have all these orcs and creatures of darkness who can't get their act together because they can't be unified. They can't be a real clan with each other. And so the hobbits just kind of keep sliding through those places where evil is contentious with each other and causes disorder.
I'm going to follow up on that. One of the things I was going to talk about, and I decided I didn't have time. In Middle Earth, as Tolkien is uncovering the story, he talks about orcs, which are servants of Sauron, the evil fallen angel type person. And that orcs did have a language, but they were so sloppy and careless that they couldn't even keep up their language. Now, remember, language to Tolkien was everything. And he's like, they got so that they couldn't care for their own language. They didn't have their own story. They didn't know what they stood for, which I think has echoes of today.
Very much so.
Well, I just love the nature in Tolkien.
Yes.
That is ultimately so important.
Absolutely.
I mean, the horrible mountains and the ice, but that tree in The Hobbit was just, I just fell in love with The Hobbit when I saw that tree.
Absolutely. And like I said, I presented some of the themes, but there are many really important themes, and nature and the care of nature is one of them. And what happens to the land and to people when you do not care for nature.
Charlotte or Judy?
Oh, yeah, how about you online folks? Charlotte, Judy, do you have any comments there's Charlotte. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Well, I would just say thank you so much, Sarah. I read those books of Tolkien in college, and I think I'm going to go back and read again. Thank you so much.
Yay.
We in those times we made something a little bit different of it, and that's also interesting. What, the passage of decades will do to my perception, especially after everything you've said. Thank you.
That's one thing that I have found, especially as I study more Tolkien. But I think even without the study, why do I go back and read it? Because I find comfort, I find hope, but also I find it speaks to different experiences that I've had since the last time. I actually have not sat down and I read The Lord of the Rings since my father died, and I'm a little scared too, actually. Because there are going to be some passages I know that will come up and hit me in the face, but I will.
That's a good way to mourn.
It is a good way to mourn.
As Lori was talking earlier, and the whole term eucatastrophe, it took me back to when I read The Cellist of Sarajevo, which was a beautiful book. And, the bombings and the catastrophe, and you talk about go out and create something. And the celloist created something so beautiful in the midst of catastrophe.
Yes.
When you said eucatastrophe, I thought one word, 2 words jumped in my mind, and that was Tom Bombadil. He is like that.
The unexpected, yeah.
Absolutely.
All
right.
Or as Tolkien likes to say, something unlooked for.
Well, what is looked for in our family is just being here. We learn so much and we share so much, and we know how to do things together.
Step one in our future.
Great. Thank you all for being so attentive.